My daughter texted me at 2 a.m. Mom, grab dad and run. Don't trust your son. I woke my husband and we left. In the morning, it turned out that my son had already. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I never thought I would be the kind of woman who had to run from her own son. That was someone else's story. Something you read about in a magazine at the dentist's office, shaking your head and thinking, how does a mother let it come to that? But here I am, Marlene Harper, 67 years old, sitting at my kitchen table in a house that almost wasn't mine anymore, telling you exactly how it happened. Jim and I had lived in our home on Clover Ridge Road for 31 years, a white colonial with green shutters, 2 oak trees in the front yard that Jim planted the spring we moved in, and a porch swing that creaked just enough to remind you it was real. We raised 2 children in that house. Sandra, our daughter, moved to Portland when she was 25 and built herself a good, quiet life there with her husband and their dog. And Kevin, our son, our youngest, stayed close. Danville, Ohio, 40 minutes away. We saw him most Sundays. For a long time, that felt like a blessing. Kevin had always been the charming one. Where Sandra was careful and measured, Kevin filled a room. He laughed loudly, hugged hard, never forgot a birthday. When he married Tara 9 years ago, I told Jim she was sharp in a way that made me slightly uncomfortable. The way she watched things, calculated. Jim told me I was being unfair to a woman I barely knew. I decided he was right. I let it go. I should not have let it go. The first sign came about 2 years before everything fell apart. Kevin started coming around more, not on Sundays, but on weekdays, unannounced. He'd walk through the house, comment on things. That roof's looking tired, Dad. You know what this place would be worth if you updated the kitchen? Small observations. I told myself he was just being helpful, attentive. Wasn't that what we'd always wanted from our children? Then Tara started joining him. She had opinions about our finances that surprised me. Over dinner one evening, she mentioned, casually, the way you mention the weather, that a neighbor of hers had put their house in a trust to protect it from probate. She looked at Jim when she said it, not at me. Jim nodded thoughtfully. I changed the subject. 6 months later, Kevin brought papers to Sunday dinner. He set them beside the bread basket like they were nothing. Just an estate planning thing, he said. Sandra already knows about it. This just makes things cleaner when the time comes. I asked what Sandra had said exactly. He smiled and said she was on board. I did not sign anything that evening. I told him I wanted to read it first. His smile didn't change, but something behind his eyes went still. That stillness stayed with me. Over the following months, small things accumulated. A phone call I wasn't supposed to overhear, where Kevin told someone the house would be dealt with by spring. A moment when I found Tara in our upstairs hallway, standing in the doorway of the guest room, looking at it the way people look at empty space they're already imagining furnished differently. When I asked her what she was doing, she said she'd been looking for the bathroom. She had been to our home over 100 times. She knew where the bathroom was. I told myself I was getting paranoid. I was 67. Maybe I was seeing shadows where there were none. And then came the night that changed everything. It was a Wednesday in November. Jim had been asleep since 9:30, and I was still up, reading, when my phone lit up on the nightstand. A text from Sandra, 2:14 in the morning her time, which meant she'd stayed up past midnight in Portland to send it. Mom, I need you to wake up Dad and leave the house. Go somewhere Kevin doesn't know. Don't use the landline. I'll explain everything. Please don't wait. And then, seconds later, a second message. Don't trust Kevin. I sat there for a moment with the phone in my hands, my heart doing something loud and unfamiliar in my chest. Sandra was not dramatic. Sandra was the child who'd made spreadsheets at age 12, who'd called me from college to say she'd already filed her taxes. She did not send messages like this. I got up, went to Jim's side of the bed, and put my hand on his shoulder. Jim, I said, we need to go. We drove to the Holiday Inn off Route 36 in the dark. Jim didn't ask many questions until we were inside the room with the door bolted and the chain on. Then he sat on the edge of the bed in his coat. He hadn't even stopped to take it off, and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since the night Sandra had a car accident at 19 and we'd waited for the hospital to call. "Tell me," he said. I showed him the messages. He read them twice. Then he called Sandra himself, even though it was nearly 3 in the morning. She picked up on the first ring. She had been waiting. What she told us took almost an hour to get through, partly because she kept stopping to make sure we understood, and partly because Jim and I kept needing her to repeat things. Not because we couldn't hear, but because our minds kept refusing to absorb what we were hearing. Sandra had flown to Ohio 6 weeks earlier for a work conference in Columbus. She hadn't told us because she'd planned it as a quick trip and hadn't wanted to make a fuss. But while she was in Columbus, she'd had dinner with an old friend, a woman named Deborah who worked in real estate law. Over dinner, Deborah had mentioned she'd recently filed paperwork on a property in Danville. She hadn't said the address. She hadn't said the names. Attorney-client privilege meant she couldn't. But something in how she'd mentioned it, the careful way she'd changed the subject when Sandra asked a follow-up question, had made Sandra's stomach drop. Sandra had done her own research after that dinner. She'd started pulling public records. She found that a quit-claim deed for our property on Clover Ridge Road had been filed 3 months earlier. The grantor listed was James Allen Harper. My Jim. Jim went white when Sandra said that. "I didn't sign any deed," he said. "I know, Dad," Sandra said quietly. "I know." The signature on the document matched Jim's name, but the notarization had a timestamp from a Tuesday afternoon in September, a Tuesday afternoon when Jim and I had been in Cleveland for his cardiologist appointment. We had the parking receipt. We had the paperwork from the clinic. We had been gone from 8 in the morning until after 4. Someone had forged my husband's signature. Someone had filed a fraudulent document with the county recorder's office, and the property had been transferred, on paper, into an LLC. An LLC whose registered agent was Tara's maiden name. I sat in that Holiday Inn room and felt something I can only describe as the floor tilting. Not panic exactly. Something colder than panic. The feeling of understanding, all at once, how long you have been walking above a trapdoor. Because that wasn't the only thing Sandra had found. 3 months before the deed, Kevin had applied for a home equity line of credit on our property. The application listed him as co-owner. It had been denied. Apparently, the lender had flagged inconsistencies. But the application existed. It was in the public record. Kevin had been building toward this for longer than I'd realized. I thought about all the Sundays, all the dinners, the way Tara had stood in that guest room doorway, the papers beside the breadbasket, just an estate planning thing. Jim was very quiet for a long time after Sandra finished speaking. Then he said, "How do we fix it?" That was the moment something shifted in me. Because the word fix implied we were passive. That this was a mistake, a miscommunication. Something that could be smoothed over with a phone call and an apology. And I knew, sitting in that beige hotel room with the heater rattling and my husband's coat still on his shoulders, that we were far past that. "We don't fix it," I said. "We fight it." Sandra exhaled on the other end of the line. "I was hoping you'd say that," she said, "because I've already found you a lawyer." Her name was Patricia Voss. She specialized in elder financial abuse and real estate fraud. Sandra had been in contact with her for 2 weeks. She had waited to tell us until she had enough documentation to walk us into that office with something real in our hands. She had been protecting us even before we knew we needed protecting. My daughter had been fighting for us in secret. The thought of it made my throat ache in a way I couldn't quite name. The plan that took shape over that long night was simple in structure, if not in execution. First, meet with Patricia and document everything. Second, file to have the fraudulent deed voided. Third, contact law enforcement, because what Kevin and Tara had done was not a family dispute. It was a crime. Deed fraud in Ohio carried serious consequences. and I intended to make sure those consequences were real. Fourth, and this one was mine alone, and I kept it close. I would not let Kevin know what was coming until it was too late for him to hide anything. I was 67 years old. I had spent a lifetime being the warm one, the forgiving one, the one who kept the peace. I was done keeping the peace. I was going to keep my house. Patricia Voss's office was on the 4th floor of a brick building in downtown Columbus, and it smelled like coffee and old paper in a way that felt, strangely, like trustworthiness. She was in her mid-50s, trim and precise, with reading glasses she wore on the end of her nose and a habit of letting silence sit in the room long enough to make you think carefully before filling it. Sandra had flown in from Portland the night before. She met Jim and me in the lobby, and the three of us rode the elevator up together without saying very much. Jim held my hand. His palm was dry and steady. Mine was not. Patricia had already reviewed everything Sandra had sent her. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She spread the documents on the conference table. Copies of the fraudulent deed, the equity line application, the county recorder filings, and walked us through them with the calm efficiency of someone who had seen this before and found it no less serious for that familiarity. "This is deed fraud," she said. "In Ohio, that's a felony. Forgery of a legal document, fraudulent conveyance of real property. We're looking at charges that carry real prison time, not just fines." She looked at Jim over her glasses. "You have documentation of your whereabouts on the day of the notarization? A parking receipt from the Cleveland Clinic garage and a cardiologist's appointment summary with timestamps," Sandra said, sliding them across the table. She had organized everything in a labeled folder. My daughter, the 12-year-old with the tax spreadsheets. Patricia examined them and nodded. "This is strong. The notarization is the weak point in their scheme. Whoever did this either used a corrupt notary or fabricated the seal entirely. Either way, it's criminal exposure for multiple parties." She set the papers down. "I want to file for an emergency injunction to freeze any transfer or encumbrance of the property while we pursue the void judgment. That stops them from doing anything further with it. Selling it, borrowing against it. Anything." "How fast can that happen?" Jim asked. "If I file today, we could have a temporary order within 48 to 72 hours. The court takes fraudulent conveyance seriously." We authorized her to file that afternoon. What I had not anticipated, what I should have anticipated, was how difficult it would be to behave normally in the days that followed. Kevin called on Thursday, 2 days after our meeting with Patricia. His voice had the particular lightness of someone who is working to sound light. He asked how we were doing, whether we'd taken our flu shots, whether we wanted to come to dinner that weekend. I said we were tired from some travel and might take a rain check. There was a brief pause before he said, "Oh, sure, of course." But the pause was there. He had noticed something. That Saturday, Tara texted me a photo of a pie she'd baked with the caption, "Thinking of you two. Can we bring this over?" I replied with a heart emoji and said we'd been feeling under the weather. Another pause, this one measured in the time it took her to respond. 22 minutes for a simple text. She was talking to Kevin. They were recalibrating. I knew we were in a race. The proof I had been waiting for came not from Patricia, but from our own mailbox. On the 9th day after we'd left the house in the dark, Jim and I returned home, carefully, deliberately, having arranged with Sandra to check in every hour, and found a letter from a property management company addressed to James and Marlene Harper. The letter welcomed us as tenants of a property now managed by Bridgeway Property Group, LLC, and informed us that beginning the first of the following month, our monthly rent would be $1,400. Rent. In our own home. In the house where Jim had planted those oak trees. I sat down on the porch steps and read the letter 3 times. My hands weren't shaking. I noticed that. The shaking had stopped somewhere between the Holiday Inn and Patricia Voss's conference room. What was left in its place was something harder and much more useful. Kevin and Tara had moved further than we realized. They hadn't just intended to take the house. They had already begun operationalizing it. They had hired a property management company. They had set a rental price. They had, in their own minds, already won. I photographed the letter from every angle and sent the images to Patricia within the hour. Her response came back in 11 minutes. This is exactly what we needed. They've demonstrated intent to monetize the fraudulent transfer. This strengthens both the civil and criminal case significantly. Well done. I called Sandra next. She didn't say I told you so. She said, "Mom, are you okay?" I thought about it honestly, standing in my kitchen, looking out at Jim's oak trees through the window. "I'm better than okay," I said. "I'm ready." The injunction was granted on a Tuesday morning. Patricia called me while Jim was in the backyard raking leaves, a thing he did when he needed to feel useful and grounded, and I walked out to the edge of the porch so I could hear her clearly over the sound of the wind. "The court has frozen all transfer and encumbrance rights on the Clover Ridge Road property, effective immediately," she said. "A copy of the order has been filed with the county recorder. Kevin and Tara have been served." I asked how they had responded when served. Patricia allowed herself a small, dry pause. The process server reported that Tara answered the door, read the first page of the document, and closed the door without a word. Kevin called my office 14 minutes later. What did he say? He asked to speak with me directly. I was unavailable. He left a message indicating he believed there had been a misunderstanding and that the family should handle this privately. There it was. The family should handle this privately. The oldest line in the book. The thing people say when they know that privacy is the only environment in which their behavior can survive. Kevin called my cell phone that afternoon. I let it ring. He called again 20 minutes later. On the third call, I answered. "Mom." His voice was a register lower than usual. The charm was still there, but it was working harder than it used to. "Mom, what is this? What are you doing? We need to talk about this. There's been a misunderstanding with some paperwork." "Kevin," I said, "I know what the deed says. I know when it was notarized. I know where your father and I were that day." Silence. "The lawyers will handle it from here," I said. "I don't think we should be talking about this directly." He shifted tactics so fast, it would have impressed me under other circumstances. "Mom, listen to me. If you push this, you're going to destroy this family. Sandra has poisoned you against me. She's always resented how close I was to you and Dad. She's using this to drive a wedge." "Goodbye, Kevin." I hung up. An hour later, Tara sent me a text that I can only describe as a controlled threat wearing the costume of concern. She wrote that she was worried about my mental state. She wrote that stress and age could affect a person's judgment. She mentioned, twice, that Jim had been having memory issues, which was a lie. Jim was sharp as he had ever been, and suggested that maybe Jim and I should consider whether we were really capable of managing our affairs independently. She wrote that she and Kevin only wanted what was best for us. I forwarded the text to Patricia with one added line. "Please add this to the file." But the evening that genuinely frightened me came 3 days later. Jim and I were finishing dinner when a car pulled up in front of the house and sat there with its engine running for nearly 20 minutes. It was Kevin's car. I recognized the silver Jeep. He didn't come to the door. He just sat there. Jim stood at the window watching it, and I stood beside him, and neither of us said anything until the Jeep finally pulled away. "He's trying to rattle us," Jim said. "I know," I said. "Is it working?" I considered the question seriously. "A little," I said, "but not enough." We reported the incident to Patricia, who had it documented and included a note in the legal file about potential intimidation. She also gently suggested that we might want to ask a neighbor to keep an eye on things, which we did. Our neighbor Bill. a retired sheriff's deputy who had lived 3 houses down for 20 years and took a very dim view of people who sat in cars in front of other people's homes without explanation. After that, Kevin and Tara went quiet. The calls stopped. The texts stopped. The silver Jeep didn't come back. And in that quiet, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Exhaustion. Not the weak kind. Not the kind that makes you want to give up. The deep kind, the kind your body produces after it has been running on adrenaline and determination for 3 weeks straight. The kind that tells you you're still standing, but you need to rest. Sandra came to stay for a long weekend. She slept in the guest room, the one Tara had stood in the doorway of, measuring with her eyes. And in the mornings, the 3 of us sat on the porch with coffee, and Jim told old stories about the early years on Clover Ridge Road, and Sandra laughed at the ones she'd heard 100 times, and I let myself feel, just for a few days, the particular warmth of a family that is choosing each other. It wasn't over, not even close. But for 4 days, I let myself breathe. The call came on a Thursday, 2 weeks after the quiet had settled in. It wasn't from Kevin this time. It was from a man who introduced himself as Daniel Rhee, a mediator. He explained that Kevin and Tara had hired him to facilitate a family conversation about the property dispute, and that he was reaching out on their behalf to see if Jim and I would be open to a voluntary mediation session. I listened to the whole pitch before I responded. It was a good pitch. Daniel Rhee had a warm, unhurried voice and chose his words carefully. He said things like resolution and mutual understanding and preserving family relationships. And I had no doubt that he believed, genuinely, in the value of what he did. What he didn't know, because Kevin and Tara hadn't told him, was the specific nature of what he'd been hired to mediate. "Mr. Rhee," I said, "I appreciate you reaching out, but I'd like to ask you a direct question. Has your client disclosed to you that there is an active civil proceeding and a pending criminal referral related to the matter you're describing?" A pause, longer than a comfortable one. "I was told this was a family estate disagreement," he said. "It's somewhat more than that," I said. "I'd encourage you to do your own research before proceeding. I'm sure you understand why I'll be continuing through legal channels." I hung up, called Patricia, and told her about the call. She was not surprised. "Classic delay tactic," she said. "They're hoping that if they can get you into an informal setting, they can apply pressure or get you to agree to something that weakens your position. Do not engage." I had no intention of engaging, but the call told me something important. Kevin and Tara were scared. Scared people reach for anything available. Mediation, charm, guilt, threat. And the fact that they'd moved to charm meant the threats hadn't worked. That was progress. That was information. What I needed now. What I had needed for a while without quite knowing how to ask for it, was to remember that I was not alone in the world beyond my immediate family. Because the truth was that the last 2 months had been isolating in a way I hadn't fully admitted to myself. I'd stopped going to my Thursday morning garden club. I'd declined invitations. I'd been so focused on the fight that I'd retreated inward, and retreat, I was beginning to understand, had a cost. My friend Cecilia had been calling and leaving voicemails every week for 6 weeks. Cecilia Drummond, who had known me for 24 years, who had been at my table for every Thanksgiving since 2002, who had driven Jim to his first cardiac stress test when I'd been down with a respiratory infection and couldn't do it myself. I had been returning her calls with short texts. "Doing okay? Just busy. Talk soon." As if I were fine, as if nothing was happening. I called her on a Friday morning, and when she answered, I simply said, "Cece, I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen for a while." I told her everything. She listened for almost 40 minutes without interrupting. Then she said, in the particular voice she reserved for things that genuinely upset her, "That boy. That boy." And then, "Marlene, what do you need?" What I needed, it turned out, was exactly what she offered. Not advice, not action, just presence. The steady external confirmation that what I was experiencing was real, that my anger was legitimate, that I was not, as Tara had suggested in her text message, suffering from age-related judgment impairment. Cecilia's outrage on my behalf was clarifying in a way that legal documents, for all their importance, were not. She came over the next afternoon with a casserole and 2 bottles of wine, and the 3 of us, she and Jim and I, sat at the kitchen table until 10 o'clock that night. Jim told her about the night we'd driven to the Holiday Inn, and Cecilia's expression moved through several distinct phases of emotion, ending somewhere around quiet fury. At one point, she said, "I always thought there was something off about Tara, the way she looked at this house." "I thought so too," I said. "I let Jim convince me I was being uncharitable." Jim looked down at his wine glass. "I know," he said quietly. "I know I did." We didn't make it a moment of blame. That was important. Jim wasn't Kevin's accomplice. He had been trusting, which is a different thing entirely. The difference between trust and complicity is intention, and I had never doubted Jim's. Beyond Cecilia, Sandra had connected me with a support group, an online community for victims of elder financial abuse run through a legal aid nonprofit in Cincinnati. I was resistant at first. I am a private person by nature, and the idea of discussing family matters with strangers felt uncomfortable. But Sandra sent me the link, and I read through the forum for an hour one evening, and what I found there was not what I'd feared. I found people who sounded exactly like me, sensible, careful people who had been caught off guard by someone they had trusted, people who had fought back, people who had won. I created an account. I introduced myself as M from Ohio. The responses I received were kind, more than kind. They were evidence that I was not the only person in the world who had sat in a Holiday Inn at 3 in the morning with her husband's coat still on his shoulders, trying to understand how a family comes to this. Kevin and Tara were watching and waiting. I could feel it, the way you feel eyes on the back of your neck in a quiet room. But I was no longer a woman standing alone in the middle of an empty field. I had a lawyer, a daughter, a husband, a friend of 24 years, and a community of people who had walked this road before me. Let them watch, I thought. Let them try to figure out what I'm going to do next. They came on a Sunday. Of course they came on a Sunday. Kevin had always understood that Sunday was our softest day, the day that smelled like roasting chicken and felt like forgiveness. I saw the car from the kitchen window. Tara's white sedan, not Kevin's Jeep. A deliberate choice, I thought later. Less threatening, more domestic. They'd planned this. I called Jim into the kitchen. "Kevin and Tara are outside," I said. Jim straightened. "Do we let them in?" I considered for approximately 3 seconds. "Yes," I said. "I want to hear what they say." I opened the door before they knocked. Tara had a baked arrangement of something. Muffins, maybe, or cookies, wrapped in cellophane and tied with a ribbon. Kevin looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. There were shadows under his eyes, and the easy looseness that usually lived in his posture was gone, replaced by something held carefully in place. "Mom," he said, "can we come in?" We sat in the living room. I did not offer coffee. Jim sat beside me on the couch. Kevin and Tara took the 2 chairs across from us, and Tara set the baked goods on the coffee table like a peace offering in a ceremony, which, I suppose, was exactly what it was. Kevin spoke first. He had prepared for this. I could tell by the way he began, not with explanations or justifications, but with an expression of pain so practiced it almost looked real. He said he was sorry. He said things had gone further than he'd intended. He said Tara had found a financial planner 2 years ago who had told them that putting our property in an LLC was a legitimate estate strategy that would protect us from taxation and probate, and that he'd believed it was the right thing to do, and he'd made the mistake of not explaining it to us properly. "Kevin," I said, "stop." He stopped. Your father and I were in Cleveland when that deed was notarized. We have documentation. The signature is forged. No financial planner advised you to forge a document. Let's not sit in my living room and pretend otherwise." Tara leaned forward. She had been quiet until then, and her quiet had been the calculated kind. "Marlene," she said. She never called me Mom, I noticed. Tara had never once called me Mom. "We understand you're upset, and we take responsibility for not communicating better. But what you're doing right now, the legal action, the criminal referral, you have to understand what that does to Kevin, what it does to us, to your grandchildren." A pause, perfectly timed. "To your son." "We don't have grandchildren," Jim said flatly. "Hypothetically," Tara said, recovering without a blink. And there it was. The mask slipping by exactly 1 millimeter. She had almost, in her prepared speech about family consequences, invented grandchildren we did not have, because the script called for grandchildren, and she had lost track of the actual facts of our actual family. That single slip told me more than an hour of conversation could have. Kevin tried again. His voice shifted into something rawer, and for a moment I genuinely did not know if it was performance or real feeling, or most likely, the complicated mixture of both that people produce when they have done something wrong and also want very badly not to be punished for it. He said he was scared. He said he missed his family. He said he didn't want our relationship to end like this. "Then you should have thought about that before you filed a fraudulent deed on my home," I said. "Mom, if you drop the suit, we drop everything. Clean slate. We walk away from the house, no contest." "You were never entitled to the house, Kevin. You're not walking away from something that was yours." The temperature in the room changed. Not dramatically. Kevin didn't raise his voice. What changed was the quality of his stillness. Tara's eyes went to him, and something passed between them. And then Kevin said, in a voice that was very quiet and very different from the voice he'd been using, "You should think carefully about what you're doing, Mom. You should think about the kind of fight you're picking and whether you can actually finish it." It wasn't a threat in any way I could have played for a recording. It was delivered too softly for that, wrapped in too much plausible deniability. But it was a threat. Jim heard it too. His hand found mine on the couch cushion. "I think it's time for you to leave," I said. Kevin stood. Tara stood. She took the cellophane-wrapped baked goods off the coffee table and held them for a moment. And then, with a precision that felt deliberate, she set them back down. A small act of contempt. "You can keep them. I don't want them back." They left without another word. I heard the white sedan start in the driveway and pull away. Jim let out a long breath. "Are you all right? Was I all right?" I sat in my living room with the Sunday light coming through the windows and thought about the fact that my son had just sat in my good chair and threatened me with careful, deniable words, and that his wife had almost invented fictional grandchildren to manipulate me, and that neither of them had once asked how I was doing or whether I was frightened or what this had cost Jim and me beyond money and legal fees. There was fear in me. I won't pretend there wasn't. Kevin's quiet threat had done what the Jeep idling in the street had done. It had touched something animal and old in me, some fundamental aversion to conflict with a person who shares your blood. But here is what I learned in that moment. Fear, when you don't run from it, becomes something else. It becomes information. It tells you what's at stake. It tells you how serious the other person is. And in telling you that, it tells you how serious you need to be in return. I was very serious. I picked up my phone and called Patricia Voss on a Sunday afternoon, which she had told me I was welcome to do in an emergency. I described the conversation in as much detail as I could. I described Kevin's final words. I described Tara's fictional grandchildren and the way she'd set the baked goods back on the table. Patricia listened to all of it. Then she said, "Good. They came to you, which means they're more worried than they're letting on. And now you have documentation of an attempted out-of-court resolution and an implicit threat. All of this goes in the file." A pause. "How are you feeling, Marlene? Ready?" I said. For the second time, and this time, I meant it even more. The hearing was set for the second Thursday in February in a courtroom on the third floor of the Delaware County Courthouse. It was a civil proceeding, the matter of voiding the fraudulent deed and awarding damages. But Patricia had coordinated with the county prosecutor's office, and there were people in that building on that day who were interested in more than the civil case. Jim drove. Sandra had flown in the night before and slept in the guest room again, and in the morning she made coffee without being asked. And the three of us sat in the kitchen in the gray winter light without talking very much, because there was nothing left to plan. The planning was done. Patricia had told me in our final meeting the week before, "Your job in that courtroom is to be exactly who you are. Don't perform. Don't explain yourself. Just answer questions clearly and let the documents do the rest." I wore my blue wool blazer and Jim's favorite earrings, small pearl drops he had given me for our 40th anniversary. I don't know exactly why that felt important. It just did. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with pale wood paneling and fluorescent lighting, and the particular institutional smell of carpet that has absorbed decades of anxiety. Kevin and Tara were already seated at the respondents' table when we came in. Kevin was in a suit, charcoal gray, well-pressed. He had prepared for this, too. Tara sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her, her posture very straight. Their attorney was a man named Gerald Foss, whom Patricia had described to me as competent, but out of his depth, in a case with this specific profile of evidence. Kevin looked at me when I came in. I looked back at him. I don't know what either of us read in the other's face. I took my seat and turned to face the front of the room. The judge was the Honorable Catherine Mwangi, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses, not unlike Patricia's, and a manner of absolute weathered patience. She had read the briefs. That was clear within the first 4 minutes. Patricia laid out our case methodically. The original deed, recorded in our names for 31 years. The fraudulent quit-claim deed with Jim's forged signature. The parking receipt and the cardiologist's records, placing Jim 70 miles away at the moment of notarization. The letter from Bridgeway Property Group, establishing intent to monetize. The home equity application from 6 months prior, establishing a pattern. The text from Tara about Jim's memory issues, submitted as evidence of an attempt to preemptively establish incapacity. Then Patricia played the recording. I had not known, until 10 days before the hearing, that a recording existed. But when I had described Kevin and Tara's Sunday visit in detail to Patricia, she had asked me a question. Is there any chance the conversation was captured on any device in the house? I had a Ring doorbell that recorded the front porch. Kevin and Tara had stood there for nearly 2 minutes before I opened the door, talking to each other. And I had, it turned out, left my phone on the side table in the living room during the entire conversation with a voice memo application running. Sandra had shown me how to use it the week before, when she'd said quietly, "Mom, if they come to the house, you might want to have something running." My daughter, always thinking 3 steps ahead. The recording of Kevin's final words was not clean. There was ambient noise, the sound of furniture, muffled sections. But the words themselves were audible. You should think about the kind of fight you're picking, and whether you can actually finish it. Judge Mwangi's expression did not change, but her pen moved on the notepad in front of her. Gerald Foss's defense rested on 3 claims. That Jim had signed the deed in a private meeting that Kevin arranged, a meeting for which no evidence existed. That the notarization had occurred via remote online notarization, which did not require physical presence, a claim that Patricia systematically dismantled using the notary's own records, which showed an in-person seal, and that the entire dispute was the result of a family miscommunication exacerbated by outside parties, at which point he gestured somewhat inexplicably in Sandra's direction. Judge Mwangi looked at him over her glasses. "Counsel, are you suggesting that the victim's daughter constitutes an outside party in a matter of deed fraud against the victim's property?" Foss began to answer and then stopped. "I'll take that as a no," said the judge. Kevin was called to testify. He took the stand with the careful confidence of a man who had rehearsed, and for the first 8 minutes of Patricia's cross-examination, he held it. He was consistent. He was calm. He referred twice to having Jim's verbal consent, which he knew, of course, could not be disproved on its own. And then Patricia asked him to describe, in detail, the remote online notarization platform that had allegedly been used to notarize the deed. Kevin named a platform. Patricia asked him the name of the notary agent. He gave a name. She asked him the session ID number that online notarizations generate automatically and must be retained by law. He said he didn't have it with him. She asked if he had requested it from the platform. He said he would need to check. "Mr. Harper," Patricia said, "I've subpoenaed the records of the platform you named. That platform has no record of a notarization session for this property or these parties on the date in question. They also have no record of an agent with the name you provided." She held up a document. "Would you like to revise your testimony?" The room was very quiet. Kevin looked at Gerald Foss. Foss looked at the table. Tara, at the respondent's table, reached up and pressed 2 fingers to her mouth. A small gesture, involuntary. The first genuinely unguarded thing I had seen her do. Kevin started, stopped. "I may have the wrong platform." "You may have the wrong platform," Patricia repeated with the neutrality of a surgeon. "All right, what is the correct platform?" He couldn't answer. He looked at me once, and the expression on his face was not anger and not grief. It was the expression of a man who has just understood in a courthouse what he has done and what it is going to cost him. I looked back at him steadily. I did not look away. Outside in the hall, during the brief recess that followed, Jim put his arm around me and didn't say anything. Sandra stood with us, and the 3 of us watched the winter light move across the courthouse windows, and I thought about the porch swing on Clover Ridge Road, and the sound it made, and the fact that it was still ours. Judge Mwangi issued her ruling from the bench that same afternoon, following closing arguments and a recess of approximately 2 hours. She did not take the matter under advisement. She had seen enough. She voided the fraudulent deed in its entirety. She found that the quit-claim document filed with the county recorder constituted a fraudulent conveyance and that the signature of James Allen Harper had been forged. She ordered the Bridgeway Property Group LLC dissolved as a vehicle created for the purposes of this fraud. She awarded Jim and me compensatory damages to cover legal fees, and she added a punitive component, noting that the conduct demonstrated a deliberate, premeditated scheme against elderly homeowners who were the defendant's own parents. That last phrase, their own parents, was spoken without inflection, and it landed in the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. She also referred the matter to the county prosecutor's office for criminal prosecution. Forgery of a legal instrument, fraudulent conveyance of real property, and elder financial abuse. In Ohio, each of those carried meaningful exposure. Patricia had told me, in the weeks leading to the hearing, what the likely sentencing range was. I had listened and nodded and filed the information somewhere in the back of my mind where I kept things that were true and necessary and terrible. Gerald Foss requested the opportunity to appeal. Judge Mwangi noted the request and said he was welcome to file the appropriate motion. She did not appear to find it a promising avenue. Tara stood up before they were fully dismissed. I don't know what she intended to do. Say something, possibly. She had the look of a person who has been holding a prepared speech and cannot release it cleanly. Kevin took her arm before she'd finished standing. Their eyes met. Whatever was between them in that moment, it was not affection. It was the eye contact of two people looking at each other across the wreckage of something that had gone very wrong. They walked out without speaking to us. I watched them go. On the courthouse steps, in the February cold, Patricia shook Jim's hand, and then mine. "Clean sweep," she said. "As clean as I've seen." She allowed herself something approaching a smile, which for Patricia Voss was the equivalent of anyone else throwing a party. Sandra hugged me for a long time on those steps. She is not an effusive person. She gets that from me. And so when she holds on, she means it. "You did it," she said into my shoulder. "We did it," I said. Jim had his hands in his coat pockets and was looking out at the parking lot with the expression he wore when he was feeling something that would take him a few days to fully process. I knew that expression intimately after 43 years. I put my arm through his and we walked to the car together. The criminal prosecution moved on its own timeline, which is the nature of criminal prosecution. Kevin was charged in April. Tara was charged separately. The prosecutor's investigation had established her as the primary architect of the scheme, which surprised some people who'd only seen her in the supporting role. It did not surprise me. Patricia had told me early on that in elder financial abuse cases involving couples, the quieter partner is often the more deliberate one, the one who planned, the one who stood in doorways calculating. Kevin ultimately pleaded to a reduced charge, 1 count of forgery with restitution obligations and 3 years of supervised probation. His attorney negotiated it down. Tara, who fought her charges rather than accepting an early deal, did not fare as well. She was convicted on 2 felony counts, including elder financial abuse, and received a suspended sentence with significant financial penalties and mandatory community service. The convictions were a matter of public record. Our property on Clover Ridge Road, our home, with its green shutters and Jim's oak trees, was ours, had always been ours, would remain ours. I went home that afternoon and stood on the porch for a while in the cold. The swing was there. The oak trees were there. The winter light was doing something specific and beautiful on the front lawn, the way it sometimes does in February, when the sky is very clear. I had stood on this porch 10,000 times in 31 years, but I stood on it differently that day. You stand on things differently once you have fought for them. I thought about who I'd been before all this started. The woman who'd changed the subject at dinner, who'd told herself she was being uncharitable, who'd let things go because keeping the peace had always felt like the loving choice. Keeping the peace, I had learned, is only a virtue when the peace is real. Spring came to Clover Ridge Road the way it always had. Slowly and then all at once, the way Jim described it, quoting something he'd half remembered from somewhere. The oak trees budded in March. By April, the yard was doing what it did every year, which was to look like proof of something, though I couldn't always say what. I repainted the front porch railing in May, a lighter green than it had been, closer to sage, which I'd been wanting to do for 3 years. Jim helped with the trim and complained cheerfully about his knees. Cecilia came over on a Saturday, and the 3 of us grilled on the back deck and stayed outside until the evening got too cold, and it was, in every sense that matters, an ordinary afternoon. I want you to understand what a gift an ordinary afternoon is when you have spent several months fighting for the right to have one. Sandra visited again in the summer. She had told me during the long winter of the legal proceedings that she was considering whether Portland was still where she wanted to be. I hadn't pushed. She was 41 years old and capable of making her own decisions, and the last thing she needed was a mother who'd learned to fight for herself, immediately redirecting that energy at her adult daughter. But she visited in July, and she stayed for 2 weeks, and on the last day, she stood on the porch with her coffee and looked at the yard and said, "I've been talking to Marcus about maybe looking at houses in Columbus." Marcus was her husband. I said carefully that Columbus was a fine city. She smiled. She knew exactly what I was not saying, and she appreciated me not saying it. I became more active in the online community Sandra had found for me. M from Ohio, who had started as a lurker reading other people's experiences in disbelief, eventually became someone who responded to new members, the ones who introduced themselves with the particular shame and disorientation of people who cannot yet believe that someone they loved would do this to them. I knew exactly how to speak to those people. I had been them. The Garden Club, which I had abandoned at the peak of the crisis, welcomed me back in a way that felt like warmth without requiring explanation. These were women who had known me for years. Betsy Holcomb, who grew the most aggressive roses on the east side of town, simply squeezed my arm when I came back and said, "We missed you," and moved on. That was all it needed to be. Jim took up woodworking. He'd always meant to, and now he did. A small workbench in the garage, a YouTube channel he'd found that he watched every morning with his coffee. He made a birdhouse for the backyard in September. It listed slightly to the left, and it was completely perfect. And Kevin and Tara. I will not pretend I felt nothing about what happened to them. That would be dishonest. What I felt was not satisfaction, exactly. The pleasure some people report at seeing an enemy suffer. What I felt was something more like the quiet that settles after a long noise stops. A neutral recognition that the world had arranged itself accurately, for once. Kevin's probation required regular check-ins and financial reporting. The restitution obligations affected him materially. He had been living with Tara in a lifestyle that depended on income streams that no longer existed in the same way once the legal fees and penalties came due. He left his job at a property management company, a different one, not Bridgeway, which no longer existed, and took a position at a warehouse outside Columbus. I knew this not because we were in contact, but because this was a small enough world that information reached me, delivered by people who knew us both. Tara's conviction was a felony on her record. That has consequences that ripple outward, in professional licensing, in certain types of employment, in the invisible social calculus of a community where people know each other. She had previously done bookkeeping for several local businesses. That work dried up. I did not orchestrate this. I did not make phone calls or send emails or do anything to accelerate it. I simply stayed out of the way of consequences that were doing their own work. Kevin called me once, about 8 months after the hearing. I answered because I'd decided I would, once, if he called. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't apologize. Not in any way that felt like more than the words. He said he'd been in counseling. He said he understood things differently now. I told him I was glad, and that I hoped the counseling was genuinely helpful. I meant that. I wished him the particular kind of peace that comes from genuinely reckoning with what you've done. Not the peace of having gotten away with it, which is not peace at all, just postponed reckoning. I don't know if he'll find that peace. I hope he does. I told him not to contact me again for a long while. He said, okay. I sat on the porch swing after that call, in the early fall, when the oak trees were beginning to turn. The swing creaked. It always creaked. I had always loved that creak, the proof of real things, real age, real weight being held. What is a home? I had been asked in a way to answer that question over the course of the longest year of my life. A home is not just property. It is not investment value or square footage or what it would be worth if you updated the kitchen. It is 31 years of arriving and departing and arriving again. It is the trees that someone planted believing he'd be there to see them grow. It is the sound a swing makes that you've heard so many times you can identify it with your eyes closed from the other end of the yard. No one gets to take that from you. No one who truly loves you would try. I was 67 years old when my daughter texted me in the middle of the night, and I chose to trust her. That one choice changed everything. If there is a lesson in any of this, it is simple. Love your children, but love yourself enough to see them clearly. Trust is not the same as blindness. Protecting yourself is not the same as betrayal. I almost lost my home. I almost let it happen quietly because quiet felt like kindness. Don't make that mistake. What would you have done that night? Leave me a comment. And if this story stayed with you, you know what to do. Thank you for listening.